Hello and welcome to Politics at Sam and Anne's Summer Series. Every week we do a deep dive into one challenging area facing the new government this autumn. This week it's defence and foreign affairs, an issue that ultimately helped bring down Keir Starmer. My name is Anne McElroy from Politico.
And I'm Sam Coates of Sky News. Andy Burnham wants to be a domestic-focused Prime Minister, but, and it's a big but, there's stalemate in Iran, pushing up prices and hurting the domestic economy. There's little sign of a resolution in Israel and Palestine, and that really looks unlikely this side of the Israeli elections in late October, and Ukraine feels stuck. Yet next year, the UK unusually hosts two major summits, the G20 and G7, pretty much back to back, placing us at the heart of the global diplomatic map.
And while Ukraine might feel against that backdrop, Sam, like it's been a bit on the back burner, there are some really important questions that stem from the intensification of drone warfare on a massive scale, replacing traditional battlefields in this conflict, and what the UK's role in that might look like and the risks attached. And all of this faces a new Prime Minister who's been pretty quiet on international topics since he came to power. Well, now he has to make a very tricky defence budget work. That was one of the factors that proved so troublesome to his predecessor. Nobody better to talk us through all of this interlocking tangle of vital issues for our security and for what global Britain looks like in a new era than Michael Clarke, Sky's defence analyst, who joins us. Michael, hello.
Yes, hi guys. Nice to be with you. First time I've been on this podcast. Very good.
Did we leave it this long? Well, look, now that you're here, and it's the right time, I think, for this, because it's just a month into the Burnham premiership, I said he'd been pretty quiet on defence and security issues, but maybe I'm missing something. Are we seeing a material change in policy, in tone, in priorities, or is it just more of the same?
I don't think we're seeing anything radically different yet. You normally get continuity in foreign policy and defence policy, but we don't live in continuity times. We're living in very disjointed times, so you wouldn't expect continuity in the sense that it's going to look the same in 5 years' time as it looked 5 years ago. So both Keir Starmer and Andy Burnham are on a real journey towards a different foreign and defence policy. Burnham did make clear that his first priority was Ukraine. The first foreign policy thing he did was establish relations with Zelensky. Zelensky was the first visitor to Downing Street, and that was an important symbol. Didn't have to be Zelensky. It happened to coincide with the fact that Zelensky was on his way to America, so it made sense for him to call into London on the way. But the government could have found reasons not to have that then and to have it a bit later, but they grasped the opportunity to show Burnham was offering real continuity to Ukraine. And that continuity is getting harder because Britain is more and more implicated in what Ukraine is doing, in fighting the war, in helping Ukraine fight the war, not with weapons, in the sense that we've given everything we've got, and we don't have much more to give because our own weapon stocks are so pitifully low. But in terms of helping Ukraine develop new technologies and drones, which it's come out, it's pretty clear before, but it's come out now publicly that UK supplied and developed drones have been used for some of these deep strikes into Russia. So that involvement that we have with Ukraine, that commitment, which goes back to Boris Johnson, who was the first European leader to really establish it. He pulled the rest of Europe together, to his credit. He even went ahead of the United States in 2022 when the invasion first took place. So that's going to get harder and more dangerous for Britain, and Burnham is in the hot seat in that respect.
Can you just spell out then, it sounds like you're saying our involvement in the Ukraine conflict is actually changing and intensifying. Can you spell out the risks and the dangers and the decisions that Andy Burnham therefore has to take that maybe Keir Starmer didn't face?
Yeah, well, what is happening is that our policy towards Ukraine is one of continuity. So we're doing more of the same. But that continuity is taking us into more dangerous territory because the war is becoming more dangerous. So we are sticking with Ukraine regardless as the war gets more dangerous. So it's going to get more dangerous for us as it's got more dangerous for Ukraine. And what that means is that the Russians always, there's a particular animus between Moscow and London. The Russians actually really do go for us. I mean, a Ukrainian security chief he once said, the Russians oppose the Americans because they have to, but they really hate you guys. And that's true. They hate us. And that goes back to the war of intervention of, 1917 and the intervention of 1921. They've always assumed, a bit like the Iranians, that the Brits are behind everything that goes wrong for them. They pay us a sort of compliment of thinking that we are the great fixers behind the scenes. And they take the sort of James Bond image more seriously than they should, even though some of it is serious. But nevertheless, the Russians really do go for the Brits. And Britain has been the most implacable erstwhile opponent of Russia and Soviet Union, except when it suited us not to be. And we always said, we have a business-like relationship, but we've got no illusions about Russia. And what that means in particular terms now is that the Russians think we're isolated. They think that Brexit, we've isolated ourselves from our European colleagues. They think we're isolated from America because the Trump administration, the MAGA elite who are in control at the moment in America, they despise us. They really do despise us. And so they think that Britain is isolated. And that if they can therefore attack Britain in some way, if they can humiliate Britain, if they can do us down in some way, first of all, it will give them a lot of satisfaction. Secondly, it will show the other allies that there is a price for supporting Ukraine. That if you support Ukraine as vehemently as the British do, then this is what happens. And we're in the crosshairs, no doubt about it. And that's the British security chiefs, the military chiefs, they know that. They know that. The Russians are looking to get some sort of victory over us, whether it's some sort of military victory, whether it's enticing us into a crisis that we can't handle, whether it's some sort of major cyber attack, or some event that we are moving towards, some sort of militarized event in which we will lose quite badly. And that will be a lesson to everybody else in Europe that supporting Ukraine has consequences.
One of the big questions that is arising for me is that you know a lot about this deep strike capability of drones. And we used to sort of graze Russian territory by about 100 or so miles across the Ukrainian border with attacks. Now we're reaching about 1,000 miles into Russia's territory. I think you alluded briefly to the fact that we know that some of these attacks have been massively impactful. They've destroyed Russian logistics, infrastructure. There's a lot of details just emerged. A great story. I think it's a sort of, I know whether it's a sort of the reverse of a bridge too far, about the Russian-held bridge at Kherson, which was destroyed last year with about 1.5 tons of explosives delivered in a drone operation in which a British company was very, very heavily involved in those drones, the manufacture, operation of those drones. Now, great. I mean, I'm quite gung-ho about this. I think that the Russians absolutely, anything damage we can do to help Ukrainians, great. But it is a shift in red lines, isn't it? And should we be having more political debate about this deep strike capability and the risk to which it exposes us?
Yeah, because we're entering into a new version of warfare. We talk about sixth generation warfare, and sixth generation is the warfare of robotics. We talk about drones a lot because that's what we see, but drones are only the tip of the iceberg of robotics in general. And so robotic tanks, robotic stretchers, medical stretchers, which the Ukrainians have used at least 26,000 times this year to evacuate people on a sort of literally a robot stretcher that turns up with a blanket and the wounded soldier pulls onto it and the stretcher takes them out. Robotics is sixth generation warfare, and it occurs in all areas of land, sea and air. But in drone technologies in particular, there really is something new here. I mean, drones have been around for a very long time. The old V1, the old doodlebug of the Second World War, that was a drone. And funnily enough, Ukraine's best drone at the moment, the 5.5, the Flamingo, looks just like a V1. And it functions pretty much like a V1, but it goes further and it's heavier and can fly. They've got it down to as low as 100 feet because it's got the radar signature of an elephant. But they can bring it in low, and they're having some real success with the 5 points, the FP5, the Flamingo. But the thing that's new about drones is, one, is that they can be produced in mass very cheaply. And two, they now, compared to the doodlebug of the Second World War, are very, very accurate. And what we're facing now is a new version of strategic bombing. All through our lives and our recent history, Britain's recent, or the world's recent history, strategic bombing wasn't very effective because you can drop tons and tons of bombs on cities and they do immense damage, but they don't change very much. It's very hard to hit another country strategically with bombs. But now we're in an era of drones, which are cheap. They can be produced in their thousands, not in their dozens or hundreds, and they're accurate. And so we're all facing the possibility, as we see in Ukraine, that two countries can bombard each other quite effectively and pick their targets. So the Russians,
what about the politics of this then, Michael? Come on, because that's the two countries. Absolutely, they are two combatants.
Yeah. They're knocking lumps out of each other now.
Knocking lumps out of each other. But is there, we have quietly changed the red lines from about the time North Korea got involved in the war, I think on the Russia side, that we would not do deep strike materially into Russia at scale. Now we seem to be doing it. Do you feel we've had enough of a political discussion about that? Because you made the point high up that you feel we are exposed to risk for the way that the Russians see the UK. And this is clearly going to make matters materially riskier. May still be the right thing to do. I harp on it because I do slightly think it's something missing from the political debate about defence.
No, I think you're absolutely right. When we provided Storm Shadow, which is the British missile with range of about 500 miles, we said we're happy for Storm Shadow to be used inside Russia because we trust you, Ukraine, that you're going for military targets and that these make a material difference to the front lines. That you're bombarding logistics supplies that would otherwise end up on the front lines in Ukraine. What we're now doing is assisting in the deep strike, strategic deep strike, which has now entered a new era. That's my point, really. Strategic strike hasn't moved on very much from the 1920s until the 2020s. And here we are now with accurate deep strike, where two countries can hit each other really hard, really effectively with drones and increasingly soon with ballistic missiles. And that's a threshold that we have drifted across without much discussion, except in military terms, because we're completely committed to helping Ukraine.
Can I just ask a factual question, Michael? Does the Prime Minister, will Andy Burnham get involved in the kind of targeting that we'll talk about? Does he have to authorise the strikes that are so deep into Russian territory involving British assets?
That's not been the case so far. What we have said is that we're happy with the targeting decisions which the Ukrainians have made. On the other hand, I would expect that the Ministry of Defence would want the Prime Minister to know what sorts of targets the Ukrainians are aiming to line up in case there are any red lines for us. I don't know that, but that's what I would guess. But it hasn't been the case. We took the view when we supplied Storm Shadow that we trust your targeting and we know what types of things you're targeting. We did that in conjunction, of course, with the Biden administration in the United States. We had a very close relationship with them on targeting, which we don't now have with the Trump administration. So we had a sort of an implicit understanding, and I think that still applies. But I'd be surprised if Downing Street wasn't brought into some discussions that the MOD must have with their Ukrainian counterparts. But we wouldn't publicly say, I'm sure, that we have targets that we approve of and targets we disapprove of. I'm sure we wouldn't say that. But I think that privately, I think we must know some of their targeting intentions. And certainly, British planners have been working with the Ukrainians. I mean, Tony Radakin, when he was chief of the defence staff, and now it's Rick Knighton who's chief of the defence staff. But Tony Radakin was working, and his staff were working pretty closely with the Ukrainians on their offensive plans, their local offensive plans in Ukraine, and some of their larger strategic plans.
Well, I suppose that unsettling picture from both of you of how the conflict with Russia, how we're getting more involved with it, does explain one of the reasons that John Healey resigned as Defence Secretary when he said we're just not prepared, and there is that threat from Russia that could materialise for us before 2030. Now I understand where that comes from, which I suppose takes us neatly to the question of whether we can defend ourselves and defence spending, which is pretty much one of the biggest issues that won't go away. I suppose, Michael, my question for you is quite a narrowly political one, which is, by when do you think they're going to have to raise the money in order to fund defence? Do they have to do it this autumn? Is it later? When are people expecting it, and how big a leap does it feel?
Well, I think it's got to go some way further than the Defence Investment Plan that was produced. And that Defence Investment Plan was the catalyst, really, for John Healey leaving the government and writing that famous, very destructive letter to Keir Starmer's premiership, where he said, you are unable and the Treasury is unwilling to release the money that is required to fulfil your plan, the plan that you approved. And that was a pretty devastating judgment. You are unable to do it, and as you say, John Healey is now in the hot seat in the Chancellor's room. Dan Jarvis, his successor as Minister of Defence for a short time, said, "I was told when I took over, make the case for the next spending review, make the case for 3% sooner in the next review." So, in other words, you're not going to get any more now, really, a little bit more, but make the case next year, which is a way of fobbing off the Ministry of Defence. In cash terms, they need another about 20 billion over 4 years. They needed 28 billion over 4 years to implement the plan the government wanted them to implement. And they were offered in cash terms, in reality, about 10 billion. It was said to be 13 and a half, but it wasn't really. In terms of real money, take away the funny money from the Treasury, then it was about 10 billion. So the government committed in the Defence Investment Plan about a third of what they needed to commit to achieve their plan. So what they now need to do, what Burnham, I think, needs to do, is to say that Defence Investment Plan was part one. Part two we're working on now, and we'll move towards the sort of DIP, the DIP, that we anticipated as quickly as possible. Politically, that would be an earnest of intent. If he simply goes back to saying what the Keir Starmer government was saying is to the Ministry of Defence, well, make the case next year for doing what we said we were going to do last year, then I think that will be literally kicking the can down the road, and the defence business would see that, and defence industry would see it. It is still the case that there's lots of private capital out there who want to commit to defence, but they won't commit until they know that the government is serious about some of these projects. And I could name particular projects which are there. Well, I've seen a prototype for some of them. I've seen a flying version of one of the things they want. And there are three of these prototypes flying. They've been flying since January, and nobody knows if we'll have it or not. There's any amount of money waiting to invest in it. But until, in this case, one of the services said, yes, we have the money to buy 50 of them or 100 of them or 200 of them, nobody else will commit.
Do you think that we're investing in the right things, broadly speaking? Because I think one thing that I've got from the conversation so far with you, Michael, is that everything has been changing. At the same time, you can be very critical of the government's record on what it's not been able to achieve on the Defence Investment Plan. But yes, so much has changed since the last strategic defence review. And I mean, I suppose I'll just ask your personal opinion on this. Well, where would you put the money and where would you take it out from? We've had the disasters with the Ajax armoured vehicle. We don't really know is that absolutely going to be something that has to be saved and patched up? Or do we think things like that are a warning that kind of investment was not the right way to go? We've talked a lot about drones, but drones will only take you so far in terms of defences, particularly if you're thinking about having a cohesive defence, a 360-degree defence pact for the UK when warfare is changing so fast. So kind of good to go. It's a bit of unfair because I'm basically saying on the back of an envelope, give me your what you would and wouldn't have John Healey give the money to.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, because what we're doing is we're trying to transform into 2030s, 2040s military, which would look very different. And in an ideal world, you need both. So you need some of the heavy metal, and you would actually run that heavy metal for a while yet, and then bring in the new stuff, as it were, over the top of it, and then you retire the heavy metal as the new stuff takes up the slack. That's the way you would do it. That's the way they're doing it in the United States because they can afford to. What we're doing is we're stopping the heavy metal, and we haven't yet got the transformative stuff, the new stuff, ready to go. So there's a gap between the fact that we can't afford to keep the heavy metal going at the same level. And we've got to take some risks with that. And so some of the risks, you mentioned Ajax, which is the armored vehicle for the battlefield. I mean, the battlefield is going to be Ajax, Boxer is the other one, and the Challenger 3 main battle tanks. And they're locked in. You can play with the numbers of those. Rather than 600 Ajax, you might have fewer, because although heavy metal and boots on the ground will still be an intrinsic part of a future battle, it'll play a different role. So that it's called a sort of a 40-40-20 model, where 40% is drones that you don't get back, another 40% is drones that you do get back, the really sophisticated ones, and 20%, the vital 20%, is the flesh and blood and the heavy metal that then goes into the battlefield when the drones have done their work. So you still got to have it, but maybe you could have it in fewer numbers. In terms of the Navy, I don't think we've got our 2 aircraft carriers. It's very hard to see a real role for those aircraft carriers for the next 50 or 60 years in what we're facing. We've got them now. They'll be suboptimal. I wish we had 3 or 4 more frigates on the books. But we've got to actually take some risks now by saying, well, instead of having the same numbers of heavy metal items that we did before, we've got to get by with far fewer, and we've got to bring the transformative stuff forward much more quickly. Some of it is coming forward very, very quickly, but it is a difficult balancing act. And if somebody gave me the budget, I'd probably spend 70% of it on the transformative stuff and 30% of it on keeping the heavy metal going, if it was me. But then I'm not responsible for it, and it is a huge risk. We're in the territory where we have to start taking risks with our defense if we're to get ready, because we've got this fundamental problem, which is so huge, nobody talks about it, which is to say we've got a 10-year program to be ready for war, which was set out in 2024. There would be a 10-year program starting in 2025 to 2035, by which time we would be ready for war with Russia. A 10-year horizon to be ready for war. Well, we've got a 5-year horizon in which we think it might happen. The government is saying we think we might be at war with Russia in 5 years. So how does that balance? Nobody talks about it because it's fundamentally foolish. It's a fundamental contradiction that we've walked ourselves into.
Right. I think in the final few minutes of this podcast, I want to look east to Europe, but first of all, west, and in particular to America. Now, relations with Donald Trump sort of cast a pall over, pretty much the whole of Keir Starmer's premiership. But I suppose my question is, Donald Trump is facing midterms that might not go well. He could potentially lose the House and the Senate if the economy continues to go south, partly because of the Straits of Hormuz. And there is a sense that he is now almost halfway through his second term. So is it the case, do you think, Michael, that Donald Trump just doesn't matter so much to Andy Burnham in the same way that he did to Keir Starmer?
I think the Keir Starmer approach showed that there's a lot of jeopardy in just trying to flatter Trump and sort of cozy up to him, because he will still sort of wipe the floor with you and insult you and so on. That's just the way, the Trump White House is at the moment. And that White House is in 2 more years before it transitions to something else. And of course, it may well transition to another MAGA presidency. We should expect that. I mean, I think that'll be a prudent assumption to make. But I think Andy Burnham is in a different situation to Keir Starmer. I think he can say that he's now looking to whatever follows the Trump MAGA presidency, and he can think about that. But the other point that is, I think, stronger on Burnham, and he has an opportunity here as well as a responsibility, is that when the United States is now in this territory where it is not a reliable ally, and whatever happens after November and whatever happens after Trump's last 2 years, the US has given up being a reliable ally to everybody around the world. All of its allies are in a different place now, and everybody's doing things differently. So we'll see an increase in nuclear proliferation around the world, where states say, look, we better have a nuclear weapon because we can't trust the Americans anymore. You see a difference in European politics and so on. And in Europe, people look traditionally to Britain when they can't rely on America. That's been the story of the last 70-odd years. And they will still look to Britain. Now, for the last 2 or 3 years, we've been letting them down. They've been very disappointed in us, and they were very disappointed, even though they were nice to Keir Starmer and they liked him, they were very disappointed in him. And Burnham has the opportunity to actually make the most of the fact that Europe does look our NATO allies do look to Britain, and Britain has this convening power. We're taken seriously. We've always been regarded as a serious player in European security, and that's not just to make ourselves feel good. It's part of our defence to be able to influence the way other powers react to Russia and the challenges that face Europe. So Burnham does have an opportunity here. If he can put the money into defence, if he can find a way of making our defence look better than it does, to get more, as it were, material power into the diplomacy that we practice in Europe. If we could do that in the next 2 or 3 years, and then, as it were, use our background in understanding security, then that will be a real plus for British defence, not just for prestige, but for our defence. And actually, it would please a post-Trump White House, because the more they see, countries like Britain, Germany, France actually making their own decisions, although they complain about it at the time, they know actually in their bones it's the right way to go. So, there is an opportunity there, which Burnham has that I think Starmer kind of wasted.
Is it a bit of a one-way street, though, Michael? Because when you say, it's a bit like the message we're sort of getting from you is Britain must try harder. Well, I'm a bit sceptical about this, covering the EU, for my sins for quite a lot of the time. It seems to me we sign deals like the Anglo-German agreement. I'd be interested to know just briefly whether you think that's really going anywhere. It had that seed big announcement with the Trinity House agreement, and then inked in 350 million. And clearly we have drone companies working together. But is it really a thing, or is it or is it just one of those steps to get closer to Europe without us ever actually getting anything bigger underway? But we did have we had a falling out over safe procurement when we were blocked. This time it was certainly not the Germans who tried to be helpful, but the French blocked our participation in that pot of money for weapons procurement to strengthen Europe and NATO and Ukraine. So, you can also say, does Europe really want Britain in the defence and security compact, as opposed to just saying, well, we're very happy that you are also paying into the pot for Ukraine and sending your drones? Remembering also that Germany, while it provides an awful lot of money, is much more reserved, does not send things quite into theatre the way that we do. It sends the money and lets the Ukrainians do it. So it's sort of not on the leadership in Berlin. I'm just kind of suggesting that we might be getting a bit of a raw deal for our efforts on defence from our European friends.
Well, I think it depends how we define, Europe. I think as far as the EU is concerned, we don't have good enough relations with that. Being pushed out of the safe thing, the project. I don't think we're entirely out of that yet, but that was foolish and it's self-defeating.
Well, we certainly didn't get anything in the first.
No, we didn't.
Round.
We didn't.
Yeah.
But the disadvantage is not huge when you actually look at the terms of it. It just means that you compete on slightly different basis with slightly less preferential terms. But you're quite right. We've got to be careful that we're not just using this as a one-way street. But I don't think it is, because the EU is not a global actor in the security sphere, in any meaningful way. I don't think it's worth even thinking about that. And I could go on for why that is. They only ever go up to crisis management level. They don't do war fighting. And NATO is changing. European NATO is falling into a sort of a northern and a southern NATO. And that's where our future lies, in a sort of a new version, a sort of northern core of this 32-nation NATO. I think the 32-nation NATO will become pretty moribund. But what actually will be the vital bit of it are the 10 nations of the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, which Britain set up and Britain leads. So you've got the Scandinavian countries, the Baltic states, the Netherlands, Denmark, Iceland, Britain. So you've got 10 states there. If you add to that Poland, Canada, who's very interested in coming into, and ultimately Germany, then you've got the locus of a really vigorous, self-proclaimed group, if you like, who all see their security in pretty similar ways. And we have really good relations with almost all of those countries, one way or another. And they like us and they respect us and we respect them. And so it's a way of escaping from sort of the dead hand of EU bureaucracy and the fact that NATO at 32 is almost impossible to manage now. NATO at its most effective was, first of it was 12, then it was 15, then 16. And when it was 16 nations, it was extremely effective militarily. Now it's exactly twice that level, and it's probably got half the real power that the 16 had collectively. So we might be moving back towards something a bit like that, if we're prepared to pick up the baton, as it were, that the Americans are literally not just dropping but throwing away. If we pick that baton up on behalf of the North Europeans, then there is a much better future for us in security terms, where we can get a lot more for our security out of working with those allies that I've mentioned.
Well, that pretty much takes us over our time limit. I want to finish with an apology, which is to Ed Miliband. He's actually Foreign Secretary, but in this, we haven't talked about his vision of being not chief diplomat, but a centre-left politician on the world stage, pushing things like climate change. But I suppose if anything over the last half an hour has told me, it's that hard power, those questions of war and peace, are actually still dominating on the global agenda and are colouring everything to do with our international relations and our poise in the world, which is why we focus this session on that. Anyway, we will be back with another deep dive in a week's time, looking at the term ahead in British politics, sort of overview. But for now, Michael, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us.